Welcome, and thank you for bearing with us as we get this webinar up and live for today, and thank you for joining us. This is the Teaching and Learning Commons webinar, part of the Scholarship on Teaching and Learning Subcommittee's work to try to help folks who are interested in learning more about SoTL research and about enhancing the work that they do with their students and their teaching. This name of this webinar is Navigating the IRB Process for SoTL Researchers. I'm Kristen Dieffenbach from the College of Physical Activity and Sports Studies, and with me is Gretchen McMasters from the Office of Human Research and Protection. And we'll be presenting this webinar today. I'll lead off, and then Gretchen will give us all the information we need about the IRB process here at WVU. We do ask that if you have any questions, you hold those for the end, and you can put those over in the Zoom box. There's a column over on the side where you can type in your questions, and we'll address as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar. So let's start off and just to give everybody an idea of the roadmap of where we're going today and thinking about what to expect. We're going to be talking just a little bit about SoTL research and how to do that and what it applies to the work that we do as educators and professors. A little bit of the preparation to conduct ethical SoTL research, and then we'll be moving into talking about the IRB expectations and navigating the WVU system for IRB when you're doing SoTL projects. So let's start off and talk a little bit about this idea of what exactly is scholarship on teaching and learning research. Go ahead. So when we take a look at some of the definitions that come out of the literature in this field, we have the idea that it's an academic discipline dedicated to the systematic study of teaching and of student learning in a post-secondary setting, where we're really interested in focusing on the student learning, looking at both the scholarly and the context of the setting we're in. We're making sure the work is methodologically sound, and of course being conducted as a partnership with our students, which will become really important when we start to talk about some of the ethical considerations for doing research in this area. And probably the most important piece, since we're talking about the IRB perspective, is this idea that it is with the intent to go public and to share and add to the community on teaching and learning about what we're doing. And I wanted to make a note here that there are several journals. I have just two noted on the slide, with the Journal of Scholarship on Teaching and Learning and the International Journal of Scholarship on Teaching and Learning that are important in this area. And this work is basically grounded in the idea of Boyer's seminal work of 1990 around the scholarship on teaching and learning, and really establishing this as an important discipline in the work that we do as academics, looking at how we're teaching and how we're working with our students. So raises the important question, why engage in SoTL research in the first place? And what we're really looking at is this idea of enhancing our personal teaching. How do I get better at what I do in the classroom? Supporting student learning and making sure that the students are getting the most out of the learning environment that we've created and the ways in which we are taking content to application knowledge. Demonstrating program impact, which for many of us can be very important programmatically, but can also be important from a perspective of advancing and growing different disciplines in the field. And then, of course, assessing teaching strategies and new innovations as we look at things like action-based learning, team-based learning, some of the different strategies that are out there. This can become a very important way to assess the type of work that we're doing. And so as we think about these goals, we really want to think about how they apply to the choice within our scholarly teaching to develop and engage in this scholarship on teaching and learning. So the question often gets asked when you look in the literature and when you talk to folks about this, why does IRB matter when we're talking about scholarship on teaching and learning? If I'm just looking at what my students are doing in classroom, what are my teaching methods, how is it working? And it really comes down to these two very important points. One, human subjects. We have our students engaged in this research, and they're a part of it. We are looking at their work, we're looking at their engagement, we're looking at different things, and that's a crucial element when we start looking at the need for the Institutional Review Board, and is the research and the work we're doing ethical? And then the second, of course, is if you're seeking to publish and bring this research out into and share it with the greater community. And for those two reasons, absolutely yes. There's a big yes there. We need to be looking at the IRB. So taking a look at what the impact is on scholarship on teaching and learning, there is some very nice work that kind of pulls together what impact this work can have. It certainly leads to impacts and changes in course design and how we are putting together our programs, training our curriculum, doing those type of things. It changes the type and the format of assessment that's been done in teaching to look at better ways to assess learning and see the impact of the short and the long term of what we're doing in the classroom. It has changed student expectations when scholarship in teaching and learning has been used in the classroom to help students really better understand their own engagement in that process and the outcomes that we're hoping to get. And then documenting the improvements in student learning, which is important both from the perspective of our programmatic assessments, but also from the work that we're doing with our students and their learning and the growth there. And then, of course, one of the impacts that I really enjoy the most when we start talking in this area is changing the standard of the work that we're expecting from the students and helping raise that standard through scholarship on teaching and learning so that we are doing everything we can to raise that level of engagement and that level of achievement of the student. So this leads us and starts us down the path of talking a little bit more about the importance of the IRB as it relates to doing SoTL research. And one of the first things I wanted to bring up is the pedagogical ethics that are related to doing SoTL research. And if you're going to engage in scholarship on teaching and learning, I really strongly recommend looking up and reading the International Code of Ethics for Scholarship on Teaching and Learning, which was put together by Gruning and colleagues in 2007. And was really a part of the International Society of Scholarship on Teaching and Learning's community. I have the preamble there, which is very small on the side, you can read. We can also send this document to you if you're interested. But it highlights the importance of the respect for the person, the student, the individual being researched, and notes the risk of coercion, because we are talking about doing this work in a classroom setting, which we will come back to. The recognition for the need for making sure that we are maximizing all benefits for the student and their learning and minimizing the risk. And then the emphasis of the student staying as a primary objective. Before, and when I was talking about the goals, I noted that we might be doing this for programmatic assessment. We might be doing it from the perspective of enhancing our own teaching. But at the end of the day, the most important thing when we are designing and engaging in scholarship on teaching and learning is that emphasis on the student impact. So when we take a look at the planning for ethical scholarship on teaching and learning research, some of the key considerations are, of course, thinking about that coercion I brought up before. These are students in a classroom, there is a grade associated. How are you making sure that the work that's being done to assess their learning is separate from the grade that they're going to be receiving, and their engagement is completely voluntary in that process? And we'll talk a little bit about the idea as we think about the IRB process. We're thinking about the violation of privacy, that when we're taking student work, are we making sure that we are removing names, presenting data in aggregate, looking for some of the different ways to make sure that that student, of course, is at paramount that their protection as part of the research process. We're looking at the timing. Is this work that we're doing live as we're teaching the class? Is this something where we intend to collect the data and then do the work after the class is done? And as we can talk about, there is the possibility of looking back over classes that have been done in the past using data from previous courses to compare to things that are being done now. So you've got to think a little bit about your timing and what does that do to the impact of being able to get approval from your subjects. You need to think about your own training and preparation. While you may know your discipline and the materials you're teaching, making sure you're well versed in the concept of scholarship on teaching and learning. It is an entire subdiscipline of research and work that there are skills and things to be thinking about in terms of how you're presenting your material, how you're designing your studies, making sure you're prepared. Today's workshop, of course, being a great start. Thinking about your dual role as a researcher and as the teacher or as the professor in charge of the class, and how do you make sure that that teaching role is paramount. And then the use of class time and being very mindful of the fact that this is the point. If we go back, we don't need to back up, but the previous slide where we talked about the student being paramount, we need to make sure that the use of class time, the primary objective is the learning of the student. The research is secondary and not flipped as we think about designing our plans. And then thinking about those essential questions. Am I causing harm to my students? Am I providing benefit? And then, of course, am I fulfilling my professional obligation, both as a teacher in the classroom and as a research? And there are some very nice studies, I screenshotted 3 of them on the slide there, that can really help you think through some of these different obligations to planning ethical-based research in the field. And so when we start to think a little bit about planning for the data collection, when we talk about scholarship on teaching and learning, which can become very important as we think about what you're going to be talking about in your IRB process, some of the most common ways in this area are, of course, collecting and systematically reviewing student work in the aggregate. So separate from our grading process, the process of looking through rubric-based and another research tools-based ways of assessing the work and the process of the students as subjects separate from students as graded learners. Large-scale institutional tracking of process and product for the students. Ethnographic interviews that are done for the purpose of looking at that learning process. Classroom observation, which could be done through videotape or someone sitting in and taking notes, or various different ethnographic and observational methods. The development of course portfolios that students will be turning in over time that can be looked at and reviewed. Of course, the use of questionnaires, surveys, and focus groups, which are a little more common in behavioral research, and the use of some sort of taping or data collection method from that perspective. So as we think about these things, we really want, after we've planned our study, we want to start to think about now applying for the IRB approval. And that's where Gretchen's going to take over and tell us a little bit more about that process.
Thank you, Kristen. So first of all, thanks a lot for that foundation because it was really helpful. And it leads well into now that you have your research and you know you want to do something with it, what do you do next? The WVU IRB, our role is to ensure the protection of anyone who's involved in human subjects research. And there are a number of federal regulatory bodies that are involved in all human subjects research. But the two that we're going to focus on most today for the purposes of this webinar are going to be the Office of Human Research Protections and the Department of Education. And these two are most pertinent to SoTL research. So first of all, what is human subjects research? According to OHRP, or the Office of Human Research Protections, human subjects research is actually broken up into two separate definitions. First of all, what is research? And according to them, research is really designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. It is typically considered to be a systematic investigation that can include research development, testing, or evaluation, but that is their federal definition of research. Now, the second component of this is human subjects. And human subjects mean that it is a living individual about whom the investigator is conducting research either through intervention or interaction, such as collecting data or getting identifiable private information. Now, the WVU IRB has a number of different review types that we look at and we use in order to assess human subjects research and not human subjects research. But for the purposes of SoTL research, and most of you have said that your research is minimal risk, not federally funded, we're going to look at the two categories today of not human subjects research and also Flex. And these are going to be the two that we focus on. So let's look at some examples of what we call NHSR, or not human subjects research. What is considered not human subjects research under the definition? Well, we've got a number of things that fall into this pot. Anything involving de-identified tissue samples or electronic data is considered NHSR. Case reports, oral histories, public health surveillance, quality improvement projects, evidence-based practice medicine or practice projects, and then program evaluations. And program evaluations are a big SoTL heavy hitter, and this is something that I definitely want to focus in on because there is a difference between a program evaluation and research, and all of you know this, but oftentimes it becomes difficult to determine what is program eval and what is research. A key purpose of a program evaluation is to improve practice. Where on the other hand, research focuses primarily on testing a hypothesis and contributes to generalizable knowledge. But what if you want to publish your program evaluation? What does that mean? Intent to publish, and not everybody understands this, but intent to publish doesn't automatically categorize something as research. You can have a program evaluation and want to publish that, but it still is only pertinent to your area, and therefore it really doesn't fall into the research category because you can't say that it contributes to generalizable knowledge. However, most publishers will seek an IRB review letter prior to publication. So in a case like this, what do? So what's the recommendation for this? Flex it. Okay, the Flex model of review is our new review type that we piloted at WVU October 2018. It is designed for non-federally funded minimal risk studies. It streamlines the research submissions, it reduces the burden on investigators and staff, and it can be used in place of many exempt and expedited submission types. So if in the past you tended to always sort of fall to using either an exempt submission type or an expedited submission type, I'm going to encourage you to look at Flex. Now, Flex has a number of inclusion criteria, and I'm going to go over the inclusion and exclusion criteria so you can kind of be thinking about your studies as we're talking about this and get a sense of whether or not Flex would work for you. First of all, in order for a study to be flexed, it cannot be federally funded, and it also must be minimal risk. Those are the two primary purposes of the Flex model of review. You can have tissues and samples collected under standard of care. You can use data collected for standard of care or in the classroom, or research data, either retrospective or prospective, and that is different than what the old exempt models used to be. Minimal risk interventions that are considered to be brief, harmless, painless, not physically or emotionally invasive or offensive, can be included as part of the Flex model for review. Pregnant women can be included, and children. So what are some of your exclusions? Okay, if you've got federal funding for this particular study, you cannot flex. If it's more than minimal risk, you also cannot flex. Anything that involves FDA regulated elements, sensitive topics, including things like suicide, traumatic life events, criminal history, drug misuse, or other risky behaviors, those are off the table. If you have or need a certificate of confidentiality, if your primary group that you're investigating include prisoners, tribal members, military personnel, wards of state, or cognitively impaired, that cannot be flexed. Genetic testing, international research, and collaborative research requiring an IAA or an IRB authorization agreement, you can't flex. But most of the stuff that's being done by SoTL researchers fits very well into this category. So why do you want to switch to Flex if you're used to using expedited or exempted studies? Well, I'll give you some really good reasons here. First of all, expedited studies under the old common rule had to be reviewed annually. And I'm sure those of you who have used that submission type remember that. Under the new common rule, it's every 2 years. But if you use the Flex submission type, you only have to do a continuing review every 5 years. Expedited studies under the old and new rule require amendments for everything. If you change your staff, if you change someone who is on the study, if you add one survey question, any change has to be requested through the IRB, through the amendment process. Flex does not. If there is no increase to risk in your study, we do not require an amendment under Flex. Now, I've had people that have asked me before, well, I'm a little uncomfortable with that, Gretchen. I mean, what happens if I make a change and then somebody comes back to me and says, you weren't supposed to do that? So what we request is, if you have concerns about it, just send us a note through WVU KC using Notify IRB. We've got it. You'll get a letter back that states we've gotten your notification, and that'll be it. Expedited studies may require a full consent form. Flex does not. There is an abbreviated consent form for Flex that's available on our website. You can use that for a template. It's 2 pages long. Expedited exempt studies require that you pick a category. Flex does not have categories. Here's my category. You can flex or you can't. That's the category. So as long as it's minimal risk, non-federally funded, and we know that it fits into that Flex model, we're good with that. Flex is shorter, easier to complete, submit, and get approved. And finally, you can still publish with a Flex approval. Now, this is a question that often comes up because people are concerned that if they use Flex, when they submit for publication, they might get turned down by a publisher. We have yet to have a publisher that has contacted us and said they would not accept a Flex approval. There are several hundred schools throughout the United States that are now using Flex as a model. And so this is something that they've gotten used to seeing. Early on, when we first started using Flex back at the institution that I was in Arizona, I had a couple of investigators who called me up early on and said that publishers were having some questions about the Flex approval. I called them and they went right through. So if for some reason you do use Flex, you submit something for publishing, you have an issue, call me and I will call the publisher for you. So if you've got an amendment or a continuing review on a non-federally funded minimal risk study, you may want to consider calling our office and seeing if you can flex it. Because particularly if this is something that was previously expedited and you're having to do a continuing review every year, the time that it would take you to flip this into a Flex model type is about the same amount of time it would take you to do a continuing review. And if you're going to do this study for years into the future, you may not find yourself having to do another continuing review for 5 years. So let's talk a little bit about some submission guidances. When should you submit to the IRB? This is a question that I get quite a bit because there is some confusion about what has to be submitted to the IRB as a requirement and what we are asking you or urging you to submit, but actually submission is not required. All research under human subjects or using human subjects must be reviewed and approved by the IRB. But what about NHSR, which includes program evaluations? A program evaluation, which falls under the NHSR category, does not require a submission. So technically, if it's a program eval, you don't need to do a submission to the IRB. We encourage you, or we urge you to do so that you have a determination letter on file for that particular program. It also helps you in the future if it looks like something comes up and you may want to publish, but I'll get into that into just a second. NHSR determinations are now taking about 1 day. So they're very quick. We've done some restructuring of the office and same things for the most part seem to be moving much more smoothly. So don't let the idea that it is a submission to the IRB hold you back from putting something in. Now for Flex, exempt, expedited, and full board, all of those require that you submit for status to the IRB. So which review types would you typically use? Well, as I've mentioned, if it's a program eval, it's going to be NHSR. That's going to be the one that I recommend for you. If it's research and it's minimal risk and non-federally funded, try Flex first. That is absolutely your best choice. And I think at about 90 to 95%, of the time, most SoTL research will be able to fall into the Flex category. If for some reason it is federally funded but still minimal risk, you'll have to look at either exempt or expedited as your categories. And if you have a project that is a combination of both program evaluation and research, I recommend that you flex using the minimal risk non-federally funded model. But if it's federally funded, you'll have to use expedited or exempt. This is a screenshot of the NHSR Flex application that is currently live on WVU KC. And if you look at that very first question at the top, and I'm going to have to look over to the screen here, is your project considered not human subjects research, or NHSR? Those questions right there are pretty much the bulk of the questions for the NHSR application. You will still have to answer a few questions on HIPAA, biological safety, data protection, but this is a really short app, and we have amended this application to make it short because we don't want you to have to answer questions that, quite frankly, are not pertinent to your research. Now, if you answer this first question, no, your project doesn't qualify for not human subjects research, meaning that it is research, what will happen right here is this will turn into a waterfall application, and it will open up so that different flex questions are asked. What this means now is that if you're not 100% sure whether or not it's NHSR or Flex, you don't have to switch applications anymore. You're going to use that one application regardless to fill out your questionnaire. There's additional guidance on the WVU Flex model on our IRB guidance, under IRB guidance on our website. You can pull up information on the Flex consent form template. Our processes, policies, and procedures for Flex are listed there. And there's also a one-page, and it got cut off, and I apologize for that, but there's also a one-page Flex model cheat sheet that you can print out and just stick on your wall so that you can quickly determine whether or not something can or cannot be flexed. All right, so let's look at a case study. So we've got a WVU professor who wants to perform a research study involving her class's grades over the past 5 years. Now, the classes have already happened. Obviously, it's unrealistic to obtain written consent at this point. Can she still conduct the study? Yes, but she must present information in the aggregate, making it impossible to link grades or other PII to the students. And that's really important about de-identification in order to comply with FERPA regulations. She and her research assistants will have access to the students' PII, but there will be no release of PII beyond them and the individuals that have the responsibility for carrying out the study. Therefore, the professor does not need student written consent, the key being that the information is de-identified. Now, here's something that doesn't happen that often, but I'm urging you guys to do it. When you put in a submission to the IRB for either a program eval or for a research study, cite the fact that you are requesting this information under the legitimate educational interest exception. Under FERPA regulations, a school official, and that includes faculty, has the right under the legitimate educational interest exception to request access to records for things like teaching, research, public service, and more. There's additional information on our SOPs regarding FERPA and research. This is on our website, and it is the very last 3 pages of the SOPs. So at this point, I'm going to tell you, you don't have to dig for it. Just go to the very end and you'll be able to easily find it. Now, we had some general questions from individuals who signed up for this webinar, and I wanted to go ahead and take an opportunity to answer some of those. One question was, do graduate students and student researchers need conflict of interest training? And I actually reached out to conflict of interest to find out how they wanted me to respond to this. And basically what they told me was any principal investigator or co-investigator on a study is required to complete the conflict of interest form, and that includes conflict of interest training. So if you are either a PI or a co-I, you have to do the COI training. Student researchers at any level who are not designated as a principal investigator, and most student researchers aren't, or a co-investigator in KC do not need to complete this unless the PI recommends that they do so. Now here's why the PI might recommend that you have a student researcher complete it or someone else who is on the study. If you have someone who is on your study who does have a perceived conflict or who could potentially have a perceived conflict, it makes sense to go ahead and have them fill out the form and do the training, and then that's documented and it's on record. All right, next question. My proposed minimal risk study isn't federally funded, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to get it. So what submission type should I use? If you think you're going to receive federal funds, I would recommend that you use either exempt or the expedited submission, just so you don't have to go back and redo it once your funds come in. If you have a study already and you have flexed that study and you find yourself lucky and fortunate enough to get federal funds for it, you will have to update your submission to either exempt or expedited, and our office is more than happy to help you do that. It's really not a complicated thing. When do I need to contact the registrar versus the IRB for approval of my research? Generally, you will only need to reach out to the registrar if you can't or won't consent your subjects, meaning that you are requesting a waiver of consent and you do not qualify for a legitimate educational interest exception. For the most part, everything else can come directly to us. Who can I contact if I have additional questions? You can call or email the OHRP office. You can set up an appointment and come in, and we will be more than happy to talk with you about your project, or we can come to you. We've started trying to get out more and get to the investigators because we recognize that time is of the essence and it's difficult sometimes for you to come to us. The only caveat that I have about this is, please understand that whenever you call our office or email our office and we provide you guidance on what submission type to use, it really is predicated on the information that you provide for us. And sometimes what will happen, not often, but it does happen. Sometimes what will happen is we'll get a submission in, and that submission will have information in it that was not previously talked about. And it might throw you out of Flex into a different submission type because your risk increased. So our staff feels really bad about that when that happens, and I know that it's frustrating for investigators too. So when you do call us or email us, give us as much information as you possibly can. And if you have an abstract of your study or your proposed evaluation, project evaluation, include that as part of the email because it's really helpful. OHRP staff, we're growing. And it looks like we're going to be growing again in the coming year as research at WVU is continuing to grow. You can contact anyone here on this list. If you're not sure who to reach out to directly, we have a general email at irb@mail.wvu.edu, or you can call our main line, which is 304-293-7073. And talk to the person who answers the phone, and they will guide you to the appropriate staff personnel who is most likely able to help you. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Gretchen. That is very, very helpful and certainly hits a lot of the questions that we had when we put this workshop together in the first place, and the things that as we were brainstorming our early SoTL days of research and the challenges we'd had, that we thought would really interest people who are interested in doing work in this area. And I know that we had a chance for people to submit questions, so let's take a look and see if there have been any submitted. Not yet. If anybody would like to submit a question in the next moment or two, we can certainly address those and answer those. Oh, they can speak. Okay, so yes, apparently you can also speak. So we've got the technology. So if you have questions you want to do verbally, we can do that as well. So they're mentioning off screen here, they're mentioning that you may have to unmute yourself, and if that doesn't work and you'd like to speak, just pop a note in the chat and we'll make sure you're unmuted so that you can ask a question related to SoTL research and IRB use. We'll give folks a moment to see if there's anyone who'd like to do that. And you'll have to help us because I can't see the screen as well from the distance. Okay. All right. Well, so it looks like we've covered that stuff hopefully pretty well and help people out as they think about conducting SoTL research. And again, Gretchen, thank you very much. It's been very informative and very helpful.
Thank you, Kristen.
And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to the Teaching and Learning Commons and talk to anyone there that we can put you in touch with the SoTL Research Committee, or reach out to the IRB. And good luck with your work.
Thank you. And if you do have any questions and you just don't feel comfortable either asking them online, you can certainly reach out to me via email or call my office, and I'll be happy to talk with you about it individually. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody, for your time.